And welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us at today's webinar, led by Napier and moderated by Finextra Research. My name is Gary Wright. I'm the head of research at Finextra, and along with the speakers, Janet, Nintendra, and Skylar, who I will introduce to you in more detail in a few minutes' time, we're here to tackle today's topic, which is AI regulation and innovation. Is a risk-based approach the best option for payments? And I'll cover some of the ground we'll talk about during the conversation in a few minutes' time. But what I would like to say is, again, thank you, but also we value your participation. Through the link provided, if at any time you've got a question you want to raise, a comment you wish to pass on to us, a question you have, please share it with us and we'll do our very best to include it in the conversation. There's also a couple of poll questions which I would really appreciate you taking part in, and I'll share those as this session moves on. And there's also a couple of very insightful papers that I enjoyed reading on the topic. One is around the question of how AI can improve the detection of evolving typologies driving financial crime. And the second one is 3 steps for payments institutions to streamline and monetize financial crime compliance. And my point there is they both gave a neat, concise summary of the issue and some interesting insights as to how you can take those topics forward. So they are there for you to download, have a look at them, and I encourage you to take the opportunity to take them into your own technology and have a read of them. Now, what's the format? The format is, as I say, I will introduce the speakers. I'm going to ask each of them in turn to set the scene, some contextual background to frame the conversation that we will go into in more depth as the session moves on. So let me simply introduce our speakers, and thank you very much for joining us today. I welcome Dr. Janet Basterman, who is the Chief Data Scientist at Napier. From MasterCard, we have Nintendra Rajput, who is the Senior Vice President and Head of AI Garage. And we have Skylar Neeslam, who's the CTO of Dwolla. And thank you very much, Janet, Nintendra, and Skylar, for joining us today. So let's move into setting the scene. Some comments from you that helps, as I say, to frame the bigger debate that we're going to have. And to kick us off, Skylar, I look forward to hearing your opening comments.
Hey, thanks so much, Gary. It's nice to meet everyone here. So we're seeing in the AI space that AI is starting to be used in AML practices wherever financial institutions need to implement efficient, accurate, adaptive, and cost-effective solutions to combat money laundering. And AI can significantly enhance the effectiveness of AML efforts. This can enable financial institutions to detect and prevent illicit financial activities more effectively and better than traditional methods. And AI algorithms themselves can analyze and detect with high precision a vast amount of data, which can reduce false positives or false negatives for a business. And it allows us to accurately detect which activities are legitimate and might not need to be needlessly flagged for someone to dig into or investigate deeply. So AI itself can be used for practices to really enhance, be more effective and accurate and effective. Some examples you might use it for might include, like real-time transaction monitoring, where AI algorithms themselves can monitor transactions in real time and flag suspicious activities as they occur. So this type of real-time analysis can dramatically help financial institutions respond quickly to activities that are happening on their platforms. Of course, we've identified a lot of the benefits of this, or I've just talked about the benefits, but there are lots of risks. One I think we'll talk about today in greater detail is really understanding how these models work and potential lack of transparency or interpretability of the results. So, these complex deep learning models, really understanding how they arrive at specific decisions. And then further,
So just to pause there, because I want to get into that conversation in more detail. I think it's very important that when we sit and consider when and why should AI be used in AML practices. The challenge with today's practices and what's the value and the benefit of using the various forms of AI. And of course, as you quite rightly say, there's lots of governance issues. There are benefits, but there are risks to consider as well. So if I may, I want to pause there with you, and then I'll come back to that to have a little bit later on. So thank you for that. And let's go to Nintendra for your opening remarks, please.
Thank you, Gary, and thank you, Skylar, for starting the conversation and interesting points there. And I completely echo Skylar's statements about the potential for AI in this domain. And as an AI scientist, there are two aspects to this. One is that it is definitely a very challenging problem for us to work on in this space, and I'll come to that why. And the second is actually it's a very important problem, societal problem perhaps, that we are tackling using AI. So that's something that's also very interesting because in some sense, it's a responsibility for all of us to make sure that the world is safe, and money laundering activities usually end up in doing trade, which is not good for the society. So it's important from that perspective. Challenging from an AI perspective because it's a very intricate space because, you know, the standard AI algorithms can do good things with, let's say, detecting a dog versus a cat, right? So if you pass 1,000 images of a dog and 1,000 images of a cat to any AI model, and then it learns what are the features and so on. So next time when you throw our image, it'll be able to categorize whether it is a dog or a cat. Skylar, Janet, Gary, yourself, and myself, all of us will agree that yes, this is a dog and this is a cat. But in the space of money laundering, such agreements do not happen so explicitly. For one person, it may feel that yes, this is a legitimate transaction. For the other person, they may have a different viewpoint that no, this is not legitimate, and so on. So things are not so black and white in this space as they are in the space of general AI that we talk about with respect to detecting objects, detecting images, detecting sky and the trees and so on and so forth. Which is why it is really important to continue to have something that continuously evolves with the understanding of the society, with the understanding of the people, with the understanding of the regulators. And that is why you need something that can learn and continue to adapt basis what the society is feeling and thinking. And that's challenging from an AI perspective, but it's also very exciting from a researcher's perspective to be involved in something that is perhaps a little bit difficult for us to kind of delve in.
Well, thank you very much. And of course, this business of ours, payments and transaction services, is difficult. It is complex. But of course, it's essential that it functions in a resilient, a robust way, and it conforms to all of the scheme rules, but also the governance and increasingly the regulation, which of course is coming in. And one of the questions that we will pick up on is how do organizations keep pace with the fresh and new waves of regulation? So thank you for those remarks. And to you, Janet, just to close off this first portion of the webinar. Janet.
Thank you. Fellow panelists have made some excellent points there. This is a really difficult task we've got ahead of us for all the reasons that they've outlined. But it's absolutely critical that we put the effort in, we put the resources behind it, which will involve investment. Because the people that we are trying to catch, the very anomalies we're trying to detect, they are also being driven by AI. The bad guys are using all of the tools at their disposal to get around rules, to get around the systems we have in place. They're taking all of this information, and of course, they're not bound by the same regulations, data protection, everything else that we are. So they're taking all of this information, and we're almost on an uphill struggle. So it's something that we have to work on. We have to collaborate on and make sure that we can progress and make sure that we get systems that are actually helpful. And I think Nintendra touched on it a little bit in terms of the discrepancy between what is actually a real anomaly, what is actually evidence of money laundering. The typologies themselves can be quite broad. And when you look at the breadth of transactions, even just in the UK, there are potentially quite marginalised individuals that can have the same profile as money launderers. So we don't necessarily want AI systems that will flag those up and distract the analysts from looking at the bigger picture. So understanding that accuracy, understanding where the results have come from, and also making sure that we have those safety mechanisms built in is critical. Yep. But then in addition to that, it can give us extra benefits. So it can expose things that we haven't seen in our data, which can enable us to potentially sell different products or come up with different risk profiles for our customers in a way that we just couldn't from looking at raw data.
So that's an interesting point that you touch on, because it is the assessment of the risk of your business that is paramount here. And then how do you not only consider the risk, measure it, but actually how can you use AI and its various branches of the science of data and analytics to help you maybe reassess that risk? And I think the other point you raised there is, of course, currently there are so many perhaps rules that are designed to capture all the bad actors, and everybody, if I exaggerate, is considered an element of a bad actor, and you actually want to go to a better place where you can have more continuous monitoring and evidence of transaction handling to spot the anomalies, but also to make sure that you govern and control them. So thank you very much for those opening remarks. Plenty there that we pick up on, and do, as I say, ask any questions you have us, raise any points. And I did say at the outset that we had a couple of poll questions. So I'd like to start with the first one, please. And through the link provided, let me give you the first question, which is, what do you believe is the most significant benefit of using AI in anti-money laundering practices in the payments industry? 5 options for you. 1, is it improved detection of suspicious transactions? Faster processing of compliance tasks? Enhanced accuracy in identifying financial crime? Reduced operational costs? Or you're simply not sure at this present moment in time? So if you could take a few moments just to complete the questionnaire, then I'll share the results with you as we move forward. And so again, thank you for everybody for setting the scene there. And Skylar, I'd like to go back, because I think the comments you were making there deserve a bit more time and attention, okay? So my first point really is, when we talk about AI, and you touched on it, in relation to regulation and compliance and how it can be a benefit, but what do we actually mean by that? There's so many sort of business models which you touched on, in which practices are being managed, but AI is not being used. So what's the best use of the mix of AI in order to deal with the compliance and regulation issues that we've touched on? Skylar.
Yeah, so let's talk about some of those use cases again, right? There's a number of tools that are available to help us implement AI and help with some of our AML tasks. And these all have underlying models that help us detect fraudulent behavior and activity. That might include things like online transaction fraud, maybe account takeover fraud, or even potentially new account opening fraud. And behind the scenes, these AI tools, what they're doing is deep data analysis and pattern recognition. Try to figure out from vast amounts of data, what is something that needs further review and what is something that looks fraudulent or looks normal. But when we talk about compliance and regulation, there's a number of risks that we have to consider using some of these models. The first one is, of course, we have to be aware and monitor regulatory and compliance concerns. AI applications themselves will have to adhere to regulatory and compliance standards. And if the systems fail to comply with that, there could be legal ramifications or other regulatory fines or reputational damage for a business. Another example or risk that we have to consider, it's been mentioned, is bias and discrimination in the models. So these systems are trained on vast amount of data. And if the historical data that we're using to train the systems includes biases, it can build the biases into the models that we use themselves. And the last one is that these systems can be really resource intensive to build. So you have to have deep knowledge and require significant resources, including the skilled personnel, the computational power, and ongoing training of your people so that you understand the resources needed, right? And sometimes organizations might underestimate the level of resource that they need in order to develop and build and maintain such a solution.
So Nintendo, did you want to say something there?
Yeah, just to add to Skylar, I think the resources part is something that usually gets overlooked. I mean, we should think of AI as more like the brain, right? But just with the brain, we cannot do activities. We need the hands and the legs and so on and so forth. Therefore, while we can use AI to do what it does, but the whole process in some sense has to be modified. Therefore, not just the technical team, but the larger ecosystem needs to be ready to be able to change the processes, or maybe bring in human in the loop, as he's saying, because of biases and so on. So the whole process needs to change rather than just using AI, and also thinking of AI just as a black box which comes in and then just suddenly improves the efficiency, as you had one of your poll answers, or maybe AI that kind of increase the accuracy. We should not think of it as like a black box that comes in and then just suddenly all of those things improve. It needs a much tighter integration with existing processes, existing systems, and so on. Only then those benefits would need to be realized, which means that people who are working behind the scenes on building those AI models and so on, they need to understand the process, they need to understand the ecosystem, they need to understand the data, they need to understand who do these reports go to and how the regulators use those reports and so on. And at the same time, all these other folks from the regulations and so on, they also need to understand that, okay, it's an AI algorithm that has generated this, therefore I need to be extra careful to absorb these and so on. So I think the whole ecosystem needs to be more transparent rather than just taking this as a black box and putting it in, which is what will make it more effective rather than just a buzzword.
So Janet, let me bring you in here, because there's a couple of points. Firstly, we need to address the augmentation of AI with human beings and people and so on, okay, which is to be touched on. And I suppose if you're using tech in the best way, then obviously you've got to look at some of the processes and the people factor as well. So how does that link and change? And I think you had a point on one of the questions as well, if I'm right, Janet.
Yes, so just to answer that first bit. So, I mean, as Natendra just really beautifully put it, it's part of the process. We need to ensure that whatever we're doing with AI is understandable by all of the human actors that are around that, because fundamentally, we're in a heavily regulated situation. We need to ensure that whatever we're doing isn't this sort of opaque system that we just say, well, the computer said it was suspicious, so I've raised it. It's just not acceptable. You've got to understand why, what was in those transactions, have that human to say, yes, I agree with this and I can explain it. Or even potentially, actually, there's information that's outside of the awareness of this AI system that I need to take into account, and I can safely discount this. So that's really important. I did notice one of the questions coming in response to what I said in my introduction about the adversarial attacks on AI systems and the bad actors. So we know that they've got access to these systems. They will be having their own data science teams try and detect their own suspicious transactions in amongst a sea of everything else, because they want to try and simulate what we're doing to detect them. So their first step will be, can they build their own models that detect this? And they want to fly under the radar. It's exactly the same thing that bad actors across the board are doing, whether that's cheats in gaming or, anything else like that. They're using these systems to try and see if they can detect their own behavior. If it gets past that stage, they are also, rather sadly, either directly or indirectly, we have access to a lot of our systems. They will have agents in banks, agents in reg tech firms, sort of across the board, and they'll see what transactions get flagged up. And this is one of the things that particularly worries me about the mass adoption of generative AI via API into technological systems, is that all of that data is being sent via API to a third party who are using humans to validate the data that's come in with the output from the generative AI. Those humans are usually located in sort of cheap labor countries, which we know correlate very highly with the prevalence of money laundering. So there's an awful lot going on here that the bad actors are really taking advantage of the speed of technology. Hopefully, John, that answers your question.
Thanks very much. And before I come back on that point, and I'll come to you next, Nintendra, but I did post you a question, a poll question a few minutes back, and let me share the results with you. And just to remind you, the question was, what do you believe is the most significant benefit of using AI in anti-money laundering practices in the payments industry? And if I just round it up for you, improved detection of suspicious transactions is 48%. Faster processing of compliance tasks is 19%. Enhanced accuracy in identifying financial crime is 22%. Reduced operational costs is 6%, and not sure at this time is kind of 5%. So, Nintendo, you may have an initial just view on that, but what I would like to do is to pick up on with you Janet's point about these fraudsters know the rules as well as the financial institutions. And from your point of view, given the global presence you have, how are you addressing that? But you may have a comment on the poll first, Nintendra.
Yeah, Gary, and I think that the audience is definitely very well informed in this space. I was worried that if a lot of people say not sure, then we have a lot of work at our hand. But some of the points that they mentioned with respect to AI being used to improve the suspicious transaction accuracy, spot on, I must say, and especially also the other part, which was about increasing the operational efficiency. So I'm glad that we are talking to an audience which is pretty well informed. So that's good to know. Coming back to your point on the fact that the fraudsters would have the same amount of tools or information that we have, then I think that's what makes this space very challenging for sure, and which is where we have to be in some sense on the top of the curve with respect to the algorithms and tools that we use. A simple example to understand what fraudsters know and how do they behave would be like this. So let's say I make a rule that a transaction from country A to country B of more than X dollars should be considered as suspicious for whatever geopolitical reasons, right? Maybe country B has a lot of drug trafficking or human trafficking happening and so on. So we decide that this particular rule is what we should implement. Now, a fraudster is going to try that, and then maybe later on that transaction gets caught in the suspicious activity. So next time, what would the fraudster do? Obviously, the fraudster is not going to try the same thing again. The fraudster now knows that we know that this is a suspicious account. It's just like saying that if I have to go from place A to place B and I went there once and I saw that there's a policeman out there, so then the obvious thing that I'm going to do is that I'm going to place A to place B, which is what I wanted to, but I'll take a different route, which is what a fraudster will do in this context, that instead of moving amount from country A to country B, they will move amount from country A to country C and then to country B. I make another rule, A to C is also not allowed, C to B is not also allowed. They'll figure out another D to do this and so on. So this is how they will continuously evolve, which is what the AI algorithms will have to do, which is what there is a reason why there's something that is called as graph neural network kind of technologies that are used in this domain of money laundering, that they can look at this graph, which could be from country or regions or whatever is our situation, and it can sense that if I cut this particular link, it's like saying that if water is flowing from A to B, and if I cut this, then the water is going to figure out some other place to go. So I means the AI algorithm needs to identify what is that other path that this water is going to take, so that I can police those paths as well. So you have to preempt those movements and then put in the right roadblocks out there. That is why standard rules do not work in this particular space, because the fraudsters are smart. So that's why we have to have techniques which can preempt such decisions, that maybe I simulate transactions, that if I cut from here, then where will things go, and so on. That those are the evolving algorithms that are going to be useful and important, and perhaps robust enough to handle this kind of a scenario.
It's very interesting additional comments to Janet's, and Skylar, you picked up on some of the various ways in which the AI comes together, from pattern recognition and obviously the machine learning, other bits. I mean, how are you seeing? It seems to me there's a kind of a path here that says we've got to understand that increasing regulation around the use of AI is essential, and we have to govern that. But we also have to be mindful of the fact that fraudsters will also use the limitations, shall I say it, or the structures of regulation to abuse that as well. How are you finding managing both? You, on the one hand, govern your business so that you can explain the bias, the auditability, the explainability of the AI, but at the same time, you've got to second guess what is a considerable sophisticated financial crime network. Skylar.
Yeah, so I think in summary, right, there are inherent risks in both using these types of AI tools and also in not using these types of tools. And so we have to weigh the pros and cons of both approaches. And of course, I don't imagine any approach where a business is saying, this doesn't make sense for me to implement this type of solution or to explore this type of thing. It's very obvious that we're all going to be spending time digging in, understanding, and exploring these new technologies. But we have to be mindful of the situations that this group is all discussing as it comes to adversarial attacks. So monitoring for those who are using the same tools that we're using and finding ways to work around them. We also have to, deeply understand the data quality and integrity that's being fed into these models, so that we're not getting inaccurate results. And a third one we have to be thinking about, of course, is privacy concerns, right? What data is fed in? How is that being made available to other places, or potentially being used in training other models? That's very important too. But I think at the core of all of this, right, is making sure that your business really understands the models that you have implemented, and how they're making decisions. And also thinking that while there are lots of off-the-shelf types of tools and capabilities that you could use, really understanding, are those applicable to your business or to your financial institution? Or is it possible that you need to develop something with a little bit more custom, right? I'm always a little bit leery of something that is applied to many, many use cases, because I would be unsure whether or not that could really understand my use case for my business or my financial institution and make the right decision in a moment.
So Skylar, thanks for that. And Janet, I'll come to you for a comment on that, because it'd be interesting to also get a perspective on how you see institutions are responding to the comments that we're making here about the use of AI. But I did ask everybody to take part in the poll questions, and I'd like to introduce to you the second one. So again, through the link provided, if you could respond to this question, which is, which aspect of AI compliance do you find most challenging for payments organizations? And we're going to come on to some of these discussions as well. Is it firstly the data traceability and auditability? Is it understanding and adapting to evolving regulations? Is it ensuring the explainability of AI decisions? Is it integrating AI seamlessly into existing systems? Or again, are you not sure or aware entirely at this point in time? So again, if you could respond, and I'll share the answers in a while. So Janet, picking up on some of the points that is there. It's increasingly sophisticated financial crime network, and you've got to be ahead of that. So I'm just wondering how you perceive and see organizations responding to this, because there is this compliance and conforming element, as opposed to actually being perhaps creative and understanding the level of sophisticated fraud you're wrestling with. Janet.
Thanks. Well, there's definitely that need to be compliant. That's just the nature of the industry we're in. So, it's one of the reasons that, at Napier, we have this sort of compliance first approach. It's not about specific technologies. It's about using what you've got in order to solve the problems in front of you, including making sure that you conform to all of the compliance regulations. That said, because we're seeing people, getting around, we're seeing huge rates of false positives. We know that a lot's being missed. And we know from research that there are plenty of bad actors using these systems. Exactly as Nitendra and Skylar have said, you've got to use this. So it's using it in the most effective way for your business. So looking at your risks and building it in. And whether that's looking at specific rules and preempting them, as Nitendra was saying, so building models to look for those very, very specific typologies, or alternatively, just looking with possibly what's a slightly easier approach, because you don't have to second guess everything, is to look for changes. Changes are more difficult because you've then got to do the analysis to go, well, is this something that I need to worry about? So you've got to balance really either that very specific building of things that have a very defined typology that you can then say, this is fully transparent, even though it's a deep learning model, that I've got all of my outputs, I know where the transactions have come from, and yes, I agree, this needs to be escalated. Or do you have something that then sits in this, say, slightly fluffier level, which just says, this is something you might need to look at, and this is what the model's picked up on, but it's not necessarily indicative of the specific typology. And there's a whole host of different things in between that you need to look at. And which one is right for you? I mean, just to pick up on the point that Skylar mentioned, it's going to be custom based on your data, your risk, and what your clients have been doing. Where are your problems and where are your pain points? For most of the clients that I've been speaking to, it's not about going straight in and having a big bang, because it can be quite overwhelming to completely change all the processes and how your human analysts are dealing with things. It's about that journey, looking at what is taking the time, what is causing you the problems. Cassie Korzakov, who up until very recently was Google's chief decision scientist, called this using AI for the thunking rather than the thinking. So those repetitive tasks that need large amounts of data that humans just aren't very good at, but AI is excellent at. That's where you need to throw the technical resource, and then let your human analysts do the thinking, that sort of creative investigation, which AI isn't very good at, and isn't very good at explaining what it's doing there. And then the two can work consistently. And that's what we're seeing financial institutions start to move towards, is trying to use AI to automate as much as possible of this heavy lifting so that they can use their human resources as effectively as possible.
Thanks, Janet. And that was the interesting point, the degree by which you're saying the industry is now recognizing that it needs to embrace this more wholeheartedly. And of course, Nitendra and Skylar talked about it's a wider ecosystem, it's a wider grouping of people and processes and maybe even business functions. So yes, what I'd like to sort of do now maybe is, Nitendra, come back to you, because let's get into some of the issues around not so much the financial crime, fraud, but we're touching on that, but also just our general use of data in a world where increasingly we're using AI for regulation and compliance, and indeed for innovation, which we'll come on to as well. So clearly, the important point, firstly, is to know the data you want to capture and analyze that. And I'm sure that that of itself is a challenging issue for some. How do you think creatively about the data you need to deal with the issues that you're wrestling with? So from that point of view, how do you see that evolving? What's your experience of that? And then let's start to talk about some of these controls and awareness factors that we need to consider, which is the explainability and, of course, the bias and, of course, the transparency of this. And how do we know decisions are being taken in the right way that we want them to be? So let's go into a conversation around that, starting with you, Nitendra.
Thank you, Gary. And let me start with the data part of it that you mentioned, because that's also something that is very interesting. And, what I feel is that I think fraudsters collaborate much better than organizations and regions and countries, perhaps, especially in this frame of data, because there are a lot of countries that have come up with very specific on-soil requirements that data cannot leave their country for any kind of processing and so on and so forth. But as we all know, that AI needs data. I mean, that's what it tries to mine and detect patterns and so on and so forth. If it is able to mine data globally, then it has much more insights than doing it for some specific small region or within a particular financial organization. Now, if we know that a financial organization is not going to share its data with another financial organization, that is what the fraudsters will use. They are not going to make transactions from within the same financial organization from one account to the other. They will take that transaction, move it to another organization, move it to third country, move it to the fourth organization, fifth country. And all of us, people from different organizations, we only see a part of the puzzle. We never get to see the whole flow, and that's why we don't even realize that this is actually a transaction that is leading to money laundering and so on. But because of regulations, we are bound that this data cannot be seen by others and so on. Interestingly, there is this whole innovation that is coming up in the AI space, which is called as federated learning, wherein what it enables is that while there is organization A, organization B, and organization C, all three of them have parts of the data. And we realize that all that data cannot be shared across each other for whatever good reasons. AI algorithms can sit on top of it. They pass some of the modeling work to one part of the organization, which does some of the modeling. It extracts some features, not the data, only high-level features. Second organization extracts some high-level features. Third organization extracts high-level features, pass them all to a global model, which learn and so on, and then it passes on, and that iteration happens. In this whole process, no data is shared across organizations, but the collective insight is learned by that AI model, which is this whole technique of federated learning. Those are the kind of innovations that will help us go beyond these organizational or geographical boundaries, but still provide the right intelligence to solutions which are of more broader societal nature in some sense. I think those are one of the best ways of handling this kind of problem. And again, of course, I just wanted to touch upon the fact that we've talked that in some sense we've created this fear that the bad guys are also using the same tools and all. But related to this, the most important point is that AI is only as powerful as the data under it. The most important thing that organizations have is a huge amount of data. Fraudsters do not see all the transactions. Fraudsters do not see all the frauds. They see only a part that they are creating. But as organizations, we see all of that, which is why the stuff that we built using AI is going to be significantly powerful than what any of the fraudsters will do, which is why, of course, there are all these nuances with respect to bias and so on. But it makes, that is the reason why AI is going to be really powerful in the money laundering space, irrespective of the fact that fraudsters may also be having the same tools because they don't have the underlying fuel, which is data in our case.
Nitendra, I think that's a very strong articulation of a difference of approach with the use of AI, and obviously plays more beneficially into financial institutions. Janet, your thought on that, and also, do you have a sort of view on the regulatory overview of this? Because we're not always joined up in a regulatory fashion. It comes from multiple sources, all with the best intent, but it can of itself prove difficulty prove difficult to adhere to. Janet.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Natendra's absolutely right on that data issue. And I think one of those things, as you know, rightly pointed out, if we can collaborate, that would be fantastic. The worry then goes exactly as in his previous example of, you know, the fraudsters just stop going from A to B and start going A to C, is that if we collaborate within the UK and all financial institutions are sharing this insight, the first hop will then be outside of the UK and we'll lose the trail again. So there's definitely a need for some global collaboration here if we're going to do this, but it's going to be something that's going to be very, very difficult for countries to agree on, because there are countries, as we know, who are making an awful lot of money, not necessarily having the same levels of compliance as we have in the UK. And that regulatory issue is absolutely huge. There's an awful lot of conflicting regulations. So, you know, obviously we're all bound by all of the financial regulations here in the UK, and then you layer on top of that the difference in sort of the technological regulations. And as soon as you start having customers or branches outside of the UK, you start falling under the remit of different regulations, so different countries, and you've got this huge matrix of both legal and regulatory requirements that are vary by region and by industry you're in. So you layer all of that and the financial stuff as well, and it's very, very complex. It's easy to miss things, and it's easy to fall foul of the regulations and suddenly become one of those companies that's, you know, with the best of intentions, you miss something, and then you'll find because you've missed a vagary of one of the regulations. So it's very difficult keeping up. And one of the things that we're seeing in AI is just how quickly things are moving. Normally, you know, laws are pretty static for a long time, so the regulators have picked up the heavy lifting, but we're now starting to see regulation push through in 12 to 18 months that's specifically targeted around AI. And then you add in, I mean, we saw the executive order in the US last week. Things like that can happen and change things. So you've got to be on top, or at least somebody in your company has to be on top of all of those regulations and how it impacts you if you've got any dealings with any of the different countries, and not only just what's going on here in the UK.
So, Skylar, I come to you, but before I do, one second. Yeah, we're just making sure we've got the results for the second poll question. So let me share them with you, please. Just to remind you, the question was, which aspect of AI compliance do you find most challenging for payments organizations? And again, rounding, is it data traceability and auditability, which is 20%? Understanding, adapting to evolving regulations, 24%. Ensuring the explainability of AI decisions, 41%. Integrating AI seamlessly into existing systems. And again, to pick up on Natendra's point, you know, there's very few people that don't have a not sure view. So that's very helpful to us. Scarlett, you may have a first thought on that, but particularly what's happened in the US. This is a fast moving world in terms of AI. Do you think it's just almost too proactive? Is it not considered reactive enough to understand we're still getting to grips with handling vast amounts of data in an increasingly instant global environment? Skylar.
There's a couple different ways to look at that. I sort of look at it as this is a necessary component or a necessary technology for us to continue to build and develop as we are creating systems that are more real time, that are running 24 hours a day, where transactions are occurring while every part of the world is sleeping. We need help from the automation to help us build the types of systems that we all want to be able to use in the future. So I see these developments as necessary. That said, I think a lot of times we often focus maybe too much on what is the new technology that's coming out, and don't focus as much on what is the problem that we're trying to solve. So when it comes to implementing new AI tools, capabilities, a strong piece of advice I would offer would be to really sit down in your financial institution and in your business and talk about what are the goals of the problems that you want to solve. Not the goal is not often not, I want to introduce an AI model or I want to leverage AI. I mean, we hear about it and we're excited about it, but there's some purpose or some reason for why we're doing that. And making sure that that's top of mind as part of that implementation. And then thinking about like, what would be some guiding principles for you? And maybe some of the things you agree you will never do or don't want to get. And then from there, thinking about what might be some of the metrics that really matter as part of this implementation, right? Are you focused on the number of manual cases that you have to review today? Or are you focused on the number of fraudulent activity that you've identified, or the things that your algorithms have missed? What are some of those things that will tell you whether you're successful or whether you're having challenges in building these things out? But we're all going to be going through this, right? As our systems become more real time, we will be implementing these types of technology advances in order to help us.
Thanks, Skylar. And Nintendra, a quick comment on that from your point of view, because obviously this leads really to one of the core points here is that what is the risk that we're facing today? What is our appetite for risk, and how do we move it forward so we're in a better place? But your thoughts on Skylar's comments, and then I want to shift direction on the topic. Nintendra.
Sure. Yeah, I think in terms of risk, as my boss says, that the biggest risk of AI is to not use AI actually. And looking at the poll question, 40% of the people are talking about explainability, but let me do an experiment right here and then we'll talk about that. So let me make a face out here and let me choose who. Janet, why don't you tell me what is my expression out here, okay?
Well, it looks happy with a touch of menace to me.
Okay. Now the next one, I'm making another face.
Again, sad.
Okay. So now if I ask you to explain your reasoning, how did you come to this conclusion that I was happy versus I was sad? I mean, what would you explain?
For me, I'd say...
Yeah, sorry.
That's fine. I'd say mainly on the shape of your mouth and your eyes, because those are the two features that I associate with emotion when I'm looking at people.
Yeah. But you know what, usually it is not, and sorry to put you on the spot there, Janet, but usually as humans, when we make decisions or when we look at things and so on, it's not that we actually measure that the angle of my lips was 30 degrees up versus 10 degrees down and so on and so forth. We do not do those kind of things. So if someone asks us to explain those things, we have some vague idea, but we don't really have a clear explanation, a stepwise explanation of why we came up to that conclusion. Similarly, tomorrow, if you ask a human who had identified this transaction as a suspicious transaction to come up with specific steps and so on, it's not going to be as specific as it was the case. It was not specific when you were looking at the human emotions as well, right? So similarly, but when it comes to AI algorithms, we expect that the explanation is going to be very, very specific, very crystal clear, all the steps and so on. We are, honestly speaking, never asked of those kind of explanations to humans either. That is one point. The second point is that there is a lot of work that has happened in explainability in AI. So you can explain what kind of features led to this and so on and so forth, which gives a reasonably good explanation around that. So I think just to address the comment that came up as the point, which was like the most important challenge in that space, explainability is perhaps, I think, reasonably well addressed. Of course, we need to review it and look at it and so on. But the other thing is that the ecosystem needs to start to understand the AI language. That's the language that we are using. That's the tool that we are using. So whether it is the regulators, whether it is the governance people and so on, they also need to start to understand how AI talks, what it means by accuracy, what it means by high confidence, low confidence, and so on. So it needs to be both ways, and that's when it will become much more pervasive and useful, perhaps, for all of us.
So thank you for that. Janet, I know you've got a comment you want to make on that, but I do want to move on to where we go next with AI. So Janet, firstly, your thoughts in Tendra.
Yeah, I'll be quick, I promise. So, I mean, Tendra makes a great point. There was some great research done by the Alan Turing Institute that basically said, we want explanations from machines when in the same situations we want explanations from humans. So there are a whole host of things that we just take for granted in our day-to-day lives. You know, we don't want to explain what we chose for breakfast. It doesn't matter. But if you're in a situation, for example, you are refused a loan, you want to know why. And you would ask a human in that situation why. So in the same sense, you want to ask a machine. What we're struggling with as an industry is trying to apply a different set of metrics to AI that we would to our human analysts. So that needs to change. But particularly when we're looking at this heavily regulated space, we need to have confidence. And that confidence comes from an explanation that needs to be at the level that the end user can understand it. So I disagree slightly with the, you know, everyone needs to learn to speak AI's language. I think it should shift the other way. I think we need to build AI systems that speak the language of the end user so that they can understand it and be comfortable, because not everyone has a good understanding of probability metrics or accuracy.
Okay, thank you very much. And I think that sort of draws a line under some of the discussions that we launched into around not only the use of AI, which is essential, and the need to govern it and control it in the right way, deploy it successfully, but equally we've looked at the need for AI and the important role it has in fraud detection. And some interesting points have come out about, John, is actually it's innovation as well. It gives us an opportunity to not only detect transactions that may have some fraudulent element, but actually also gives us opportunities to see how we might use it smarter in our own organizations. So from your point of view, Janet, given that you're working with a number of institutions, this isn't just about regulation and compliance. This also must give us a whole raft of insights into how we can assess customers, our services, and where we go, and maybe even give us some competitive edge. Janet.
Yeah, absolutely. What we're seeing is the use of these tools in ways that we didn't expect. And I think that's a general truism of AI across the board. But, you know, some of the models that we've deployed to really pick up on those behavioral changes, we have customers that have used those and seen, actually, there is a change here because this customer's now transacting with this country that we weren't expecting. That suddenly popped up. We've done our investigation. We don't think there's anything suspicious going on here, but it means that maybe we can talk to them about opening a local account in that country. So can we sell them different products based on those insights? And again, it's something, unless you're specifically looking for that, those sorts of insights are almost impossible to detect, because you're looking at individual transactions or groups of transactions in isolation. You wouldn't necessarily notice a changing pattern unless you were looking for it, or unless you had these extra tools that could mine that data for you. And I think that's a great example of how you can go beyond just solving a compliance problem and solving those, you know, big data, you know, too much data to deal with problems, and start looking at, as you say, a competitive edge. What can you do to actually improve service for your customers and also improve business sales?
Thank you. And Skylar, a view on that from your side in terms of the, you know, more innovative, proactive way in which this comes into play?
You know, from an innovation perspective, I think, bringing it back to a point I was raising earlier, it's really about understanding a problem that you're trying to solve, and not just applying technology for technology's sake.
Yeah, and I think that is a good point to look at in more detail, because obviously what it allows us to do is to align the use of AI to our various strategies, be they risk-based or be they opportunistic, in terms of new services, new value that we drive to customers. We're coming to the very end of a session that seems to have flown by quite rapidly. And I'm not going to have enough time to summarize the various points that we raised, but we did talk about AI and the benefits of risk of using it in an increasingly sophisticated world of money laundering regulations and financial crime. We looked about some of the issues around what else needs to change, and we should not forget the human in the loop situation here. And of course, we've just touched on how it can be deployed in other ways for a benefit within the organizations. So I'd like to thank everybody for joining us today. I hope you had the opportunity to download those two very good, insightful papers. And more importantly, thank you very much for taking part in the poll questions. And before I go, maybe, Janet, I'll pass to you for a final word or two. Janet.
Thank you. So I'll say, hopefully you have downloaded those documents. I think the key thing is that we are seeing mass adoption of AI in this space. We are seeing a move in regulators worldwide starting to demand its use because we know it's effective. So if you're not already using it, please start looking into what it can do for you and where it can help. I mean, back to what Skylar said, where are your problems and what are the right tools to solve those problems? And there will be, I can guarantee, an area of your business where AI can help you.
Well, thank you very much. Great note to end on. Thank you, Janet. Thank you, Nintendo. Thank you, Skylar. And thank you again, everybody, for joining us. And I'll close the session now and hope that you enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks for joining us.